Throughout history, different societies created punishments that today seem unimaginable. In eras marked by wars, religious disputes, brutal judicial systems, and the absence of human rights, pain was used as a tool of control, punishment, and intimidation. Instruments of physical punishment were displayed as symbols of power, and suffering was often part of the public spectacle itself. More than shocking, this content serves to remind us how the notion of justice has evolved over the centuries, and that understanding the past is essential to valuing the rights that exist today. The blood eagle is an alleged method of execution attributed to the Vikings and described in some medieval Norse literary sources. According to these accounts, it was an extremely brutal form of punishment or ritual vengeance, applied mainly against important enemies. The best-known description states that the victim was placed face down. Their ribs were separated from the spine with blade strikes and then pulled back, creating the appearance of wings. Next, the lungs were exposed outside the body, forming the symbolic image of an eagle made of blood. The main references to the practice appear in Icelandic sagas written between the 12th and 13th centuries, such as the Saga of Ragnar Lodbrok, and texts linked to the tradition of Ragnar's sons. There are also mentions in chronicles that recount conflicts between Viking leaders and Anglo-Saxon kings, such as King Aella of Northumbria, who, according to tradition, was executed in this manner in revenge for the death of Ragnar Lodbrok. Among modern historians, there is significant debate over whether the blood eagle was actually practiced or whether it was a poetic metaphor that was misinterpreted over time. Some scholars argue that, from an anatomical point of view, the procedure would be technically possible with the tools of the period, although the victim would probably die quickly due to extreme pain and blood loss. Others maintain that the description may have been a figure of speech typical of ancient Scandinavian poetry, used to symbolize a humiliating defeat or sacrifice, and that later literal interpretations turned the metaphor into an alleged real ritual. The bronze bull was one of the cruelest methods of punishment and execution associated with classical antiquity, especially in ancient Greece, and in later traditions that recount episodes from that era. According to ancient sources and later historical accounts, the device consisted of a hollow bronze statue in the shape of a bull, large enough to accommodate a human being inside it. This metal structure had a side door that was used to place the condemned person inside the bull. Once inside, the entrance was closed and a fire was lit directly beneath the bull, causing the metal to heat up intensely. Over time, the heat turned the interior into a kind of oven that cooked the person until they lost their life. Usually in an extremely slow and painful way. The invention of this brutal method is traditionally attributed to Pericles of Athens, an artisan or sculptor who is said to have presented the design to the tyrant Phalaris, ruler of the ancient city of Akragas. According to some traditions, Pericles believed his contrivance would be well received, but the tyrant is said to have used the bull against the inventor himself, imprisoning him inside it and testing the device before executing him in any other way, something truly cruel. The so-called Judas cradle is one of the most brutal punishment devices traditionally associated with medieval Europe, used to inflict extreme pain, humiliation, and often to force confessions from prisoners or the accused. The apparatus basically consisted of a seat or chair in the shape of an inverted pyramid, with a sharp point, usually made of wood or metal, raised on a sturdy frame. The victim was stripped, tied up, and placed naked on the device, with the tip of the pyramid aligned with the anus or other sensitive parts of the body. Then, through a system of ropes, pulleys, or simply by the force of gravity, the prisoner was slowly lowered onto the point. The weight of the body caused the pointed end to press, stretch, and even impale the condemned person's orifices, causing intense pain and extreme discomfort. The name Judas cradle is a reference to the apostle Judas Iscariot, a symbol of betrayal in the Christian context, and the instrument came to be associated with the idea of cruel and treacherous punishment. Parrot perch is one of the most widely known and brutal methods of physical punishment of the 20th century, especially associated with the context of the military dictatorship in Brazil, which lasted from 1964 to 1985, but with older historical roots. The name comes from the Portuguese term for parrot roost, which was a pole used to hang birds, and the aggressor's analogy was exactly that, to place a human being in an extremely painful and vulnerable position, as if it were a bird trapped on the roost. This method consisted of tying the prisoner's hands and feet together, bending their arms and legs over an iron or wooden bar that sat between the joints, and then suspending the body about 20 to 30 centimeters from the ground. In this position, the weight of the body itself caused tendons, muscles, and joints to come under enormous pressure, causing excruciating pain, extreme strain, and breathing difficulty. The parrot perch was used as a punishment technique to extract information, force confessions, or simply punish political dissidents during repression in Brazil. In many historical accounts, it was not applied in isolation, but combined with other cruel methods, such as electric shocks, simulated drowning, beatings with paddles, or even burns, to intensify the detainee's physical and psychological suffering. The Schandmantel, whose name comes from German and literally means cloak of shame or coat of shame, was a type of public and humiliating punishment used in the medieval period, and even in later times in Central Europe. This device was not exactly an instrument of physical punishment in the sense of hurting or killing the victim, but rather a means of exposing them to social shame as a form of punishment for crimes considered minor or dishonorable. The Schandmantel was generally made of wood and sometimes lined with metal, in a structure similar to a large inverted barrel that covered the condemned person's body from the neck down. The punished person was forced to wear this kind of cloak and be taken out in public, often escorted by the community or by local authorities, where they became the target of insults and mockery from the population. It was common for vegetables and other objects to be thrown at them as they passed by, reinforcing the intention to humiliate and ridicule the offender. Historically, this type of punishment was applied in cases such as illegal hunting, theft of less valuable objects, or other offenses considered unworthy, and it was understood as an alternative to imprisonment or more severe punishments. The Tucker telephone is a brutal 20th century punishment device used in the United States as a form of coercion and punishment within a highly oppressive prison system. The device was developed around the 1960s at the Tucker unit in the state of Arkansas and was built from parts of an old hand-cranked telephone. Instead of being used to communicate with people, like a real telephone, the device's electric generator was modified and connected to 2 batteries so that the crank would produce painful electric shocks. In use, the victim, usually an inmate considered troublesome or allegedly disobedient, was taken to the room that served as the prison hospital, where they were restrained on a gurney. Cables with electrodes were then connected to the prisoner's big toe and genitals, or to other very sensitive parts of the body. When the telephone crank was turned, painful electrical currents ran through the person's body, causing intense muscle contractions, extreme pain, and in many cases, physical injuries and lasting psychological damage. In prison jargon, a prolonged series of shocks was ironically called a long-distance call. The device was used unofficially as an instrument of coercion and punishment, without legal regulation or proper oversight, and became one of the most notorious symbols of the brutal and abusive practices that took place in that prison before penal reforms began to emerge in the late 1960s. One of the most emblematic punishment devices associated with medieval Europe and also with later periods, used to extract confessions or punish prisoners in a brutal manner. The rack was basically a rectangular wooden or metal frame raised off the ground with rollers or bars at each end. The victim was tied so that their wrists were fastened to one roller and their ankles to the other, so that, by turning a crank or lever, the ropes connected to the rollers would be tightened. This stretched the person's body in opposite directions, causing excruciating pain, elongation of muscles and tendons, dislocation or stretching of joints, and, in extreme cases, rupture of ligaments and permanent injuries. The purpose of this punishment was not necessarily to kill quickly, but to inflict extreme pain and force the victim to confess crimes, reveal information, or submit to the demands of inquisitors or judicial authorities. The mere threat of being stretched on the rack was often enough to make prisoners confess. The dunking chair was a device used mainly in medieval Europe and early modern Europe as a form of public humiliation and physical punishment. This method consisted of a wooden chair to which the accused person was tied, often by order of a local court. The chair was attached to a frame with a long beam that worked like a kind of seesaw or lever. Upon reaching the edge of a river, lake, or pond, the chair was lowered repeatedly into the water, or only once, depending on the sentence, so that the condemned would be submerged or nearly submerged under the water. The practice was often linked to punishment punishments for behaviors considered deviant or undesirable by the community, such as being a scold, which was a person who talked too much, a woman considered slanderous, or a dishonest traitor. At the time, crimes like these were seen as disruptions of the social order, and the use of the chair had the dual purpose of punishing the individual and serving as an example to the community. The device was carried out as a spectacle, with the victim often exposed to the public's view and subjected to humiliation and physical suffering, such as the discomfort of repeated immersion and the coldness of the water. In some cases, prolonged exposure could lead to real health risks. Punishment with rats was not an official punishment standardized everywhere, but it appears in historical accounts as an extreme form of physical and psychological torment, used in times of conflict as punishment for crimes or to extract confessions and answers from prisoners. In the best known form of this method, the condemned person was immobilized, for example tied on their back or lying face down with the abdomen or another part exposed, unable to move, over the belly or chest. A cage or metal container open at the bottom was then fastened, where live, hungry rats were placed. The executioners then placed embers or burning charcoal on top of the container in order to intensely heat the metal or the wood that covered it. As the heat increased, the rats became desperate to escape the unbearable sensation, and with no other escape route, began to gnaw at the person's body in search of a way out, burrowing through the skin and tissues toward freedom. This method created not only extreme physical pain, deep punctures, bleeding, risk of infection, injuries to vital organs, and a slow death, but also profound psychological terror, because the condemned person knew that the rodents would do everything they could to flee, and their own flesh became the path to the animal's freedom. The historical punishment called the scold's bridle, also known in Portuguese as the freio das tagarelas or freio da repreensão, was an instrument of punishment and humiliation used in Europe, mainly between the 16th and 18th centuries. This device was created as a brutal way to silence people accused of talking too much, gossiping, slandering, making public criticisms, or simply being considered cranky or talkative. The bridle was basically an iron framework, similar to a kind of muzzle or gigantic horseshoe, that closed rigidly over the condemned person's head. Inside it there was a piece of iron designed to sit in the mouth, pressing on the tongue, or covering it in such a way as to completely prevent any movement of the tongue or speech. Some versions were even more cruel, with sharp points or spikes on the tongue guard, so that any attempt to speak resulted in pain or cuts. Beyond the physical aspect, which was uncomfortable, painful, and harmful, the bridle served as a symbol of social control and patriarchal authority, especially at a time when female behaviors considered inappropriate, such as talking too much or defying norms, were treated with public severity. Today, examples of these devices can be seen in historical museums, and they serve as a reminder of how cruel and humiliating public punishments could be in the past, especially for women. Another method of historical punishment and humiliation was what was known in the English language as jibbetting, which was nothing more than the public display of a condemned person's body inside an iron cage after execution. The process worked as follows. After a criminal was executed by hanging, his body was not simply buried. Instead, it was placed inside an iron frame or cage, designed to fit the shape of the body, often with bars enclosing arms, legs, and torso. This cage was then suspended from a tall post or structure called a gibbet, often in very visible places, such as road intersections, valleys, or near the scene of the crime. The body, encased in the metal structure, remained there for weeks, months, or even years, exposed to the elements, the wind, and the sun, allowing it to gradually decompose and serve as a warning to passers-by. The purpose of this type of display was not to cause more physical suffering to the condemned person, after all he was already lifeless, but rather to act as a strong social deterrent, since the sight of a decomposing body served as a visual and shocking reminder of the brutal consequences of serious crimes, such as murder, treason, piracy, or other offenses. Anatsurushi was an extremely cruel punishment technique used in 17th century Japan, especially during the period when the Tokugawa shogunate sought to eradicate Christianity in the country. This method consisted of fastening the victim upside down by the ankles, suspended from a wooden frame, with the body often lowered toward a hole or pit beneath them. In various accounts, the pit was filled with feces and excrement, creating a suffocating, unsanitary, and psychologically horrific environment. In most descriptions, the condemned, often a Japanese Christian or a Western missionary, had their hands tied, with one left free only to signal whether they would renounce their faith. If they did not recant, they remained hanging for days in that painful position. To prevent a quick death from blood pressure in the head, a small cut was made in the scalp or behind the ears, allowing blood to be released slowly and prolonging the pain. The intention behind the punishment was not simply to kill immediately, but to break the prisoner's religious resolve, forcing them to abjure their Christian faith in order to obtain release. Many who were subjected to this punishment succumbed after hours or days of agony, whether from suffocation, shock, injuries, or exhaustion. This method became historically associated with the period of repression and persecution of Christians in 17th century Japan, and appears in accounts including that of figures such as Lorenzo Ruiz, who was subjected to this technique and did not abjure his faith before dying, as well as other missionaries and converts who suffered similar punishments during that period. The Iron Maiden is one of the most famous instruments in popular culture when it comes to physical punishment, and of course it became very well known precisely for that reason. The device is described as a large iron box or sarcophagus with 2 hinged doors, tall enough to accommodate an adult. The interior would be lined with iron spikes or nails arranged so that, when the doors were closed, they would pierce the victim's body, causing pain, bleeding, and prolonged suffering without directly striking vital organs. The idea was to inflict a slow and agonizing death, often associated with serious crimes such as treason, blasphemy, or witchcraft. It is worth noting that, despite being described by most accounts or records as a medieval punishment, there is no reliable evidence that the Iron Maiden was used as an instrument of punishment in that era. According to historians, it is more likely that it was used after that period. Today, examples called Iron Maidens can be seen in museums or historical collections, but most of these artifacts date from the 19th century or later and rarely reflect authentic practices of the Middle Ages, further reinforcing what specialists say. The so-called wicker man refers to a practice described in ancient sources, especially by Julius Caesar in his account Commentaries on the Gallic War, as a type of human sacrifice ritual carried out by the ancient Celtic peoples, particularly the Druids of Gaul, a region that today corresponds to France and parts of Belgium and Switzerland. According to this account, large human statues made of wicker, wood, or straw were built and filled with living individuals, typically criminals, slaves, or prisoners. Then, the entire structure was set on fire, causing the death of the people inside the flames. This wicker man was a hollow human-shaped structure woven from branches, flexible rods, or similar materials, large enough to hold one or more human beings inside. It is believed that, in Caesar's accounts, these sacrifices were offered to the gods as part of religious ceremonies, possibly related to requests for fertility, protection, or victory in battles. The Roman source suggests that, when there were no criminals to punish, sometimes innocent people from the tribe were used instead, under ritual justifications. Over time, the idea of the wicker man became a cultural and literary icon, appearing in works of fiction and folklore, and inspiring modern productions such as the British horror film The Wicker Man, which uses the image of this straw statue as the central element of a fictional sacrifice ritual, reinforcing its presence in the popular imagination. The Spanish boot, despite its name, was not a type of punishment used exclusively by the Spanish Inquisition, and was not even originally typical of Spain, but rather one of the variants of a medieval and early modern punishment instrument used in various parts of Europe to cause extreme pain, serious injuries, and force confessions. This device was part of a family of instruments known generically as the boot, designed to tighten, crush, or destroy the flesh, bones, and joints of the leg and foot. The name boot comes from the resemblance of the structure to a large rigid boot that covered the victim's leg and foot. The basic operation was relatively simple, but extremely painful. The foot and the lower part of the leg were placed inside a rigid metal or wooden casing, and then wedges, plates, or screw mechanisms were inserted between the inside of the structure and the condemned person's skin. By tightening these elements, hammering in the wedges, or turning a screw, the aggressor caused the pressure to increase gradually, crushing the tissues and breaking bones in the tibia, fibula, and metatarsals, in addition to causing intense pain. The name Spanish boot ended up becoming popular in later accounts and in popular culture because some countries in Northern Europe used this type of punishment under that name, and also because the association with Spain appeared in legal and literary manuals. Don't forget to subscribe to watch more videos like this,